Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Edge webinar series. In this conversation, I'm going to be joined by Fionnuala McIntyre to talk about conversations. And why are conversations so important? Really, they are the bridge to every relationship that we have at work, at home, in our social life. But particularly at work, we see this as a really important aspect of how we build teams, how we set strategy, how we align around things. And yet it can be such a tricky area. So we thought today we'd talk about that. So many of you are starting to get to know who I am. I'm Mary Maguire, author of The Female Edge and founder of Agents to Change. And Fionnuala McIntyre, as I said, is joining me today. So Fionnuala, tell us a bit about you and your background.
Oh, thank you, Mary, and thank you so much for inviting me along today. I'm delighted actually to be part of this series again. Fantastic. Yeah, so I'm an accredited professional and executive coach, Mary, as well as a systemic team coach as well. And, I very much work in partnerships with my clients to, I suppose, disrupt and challenge their thinking through our conversations and really helping them to evolve, grow, and develop. I come from a background of organizational development, from learning and development, retail I worked in for a number of years, and also from professional services. And now in my own role and company, I get the opportunity to work with clients in all sectors and industries at really mainly at senior level, but emerging leaders and leaders with potential. So it's a fantastic work and fantastic opportunity that I get to work with great people all of the time. So, I think Marshall Goldsmith said about coaching being a relationship sport, and I'd say that's the same for leadership. And I think something that I am so passionate about is the quality of the conversations, because like you said, I believe that they really determine the quality of our relationships. So how we can all just get better at those every day. So
yeah,
it's
and it's as I said, it's a really interesting one because it's something we all have to do. We all have to do it every day, and yet it can be such a tricky area for us. So tell us, what conversations do we find difficult, particularly in the work arena, and why is that?
Great question, actually, Mary. And from the work that I do with organizations and the leaders in those, it seems to be there's a number of conversations, anything almost that makes us feel uncomfortable, or we're afraid of getting wrong, or we're maybe afraid of hurting someone. And, it's what I hear often from leaders is, well, I'm hoping that things will improve, or that they will get that eventually. And we can often hide around it. We might make some comments that actually, just sort of mask what we're trying to say, or we almost put the problem onto them, or actually we forget sometimes that we're dealing just with another human being there, and how we can really, I suppose, get into that arena and have those conversations that we know are really important. And, I believe that they should really help enrich a relationship. They've got to really, so yeah. So I think there's a number of ones I believe that we often put off, and we know those ourselves, really.
Yeah. So how, if we find these conversations difficult, how can we improve them? What are the things we need to be doing or thinking or bringing with us to do that?
I believe, Mary, and from an emotional intelligence and emotional maturity piece, the most important conversation is the conversation that we have with ourselves first and foremost about, how are we actually showing up? What are we actually assuming here? How do I tend to, deal with challenging situations or conflict or tricky situations? So that conversation, almost like a stock take for ourselves, I think is really critical to be able to do that first and foremost.
And then when people have, because you're so right there, because what we do is we start to fill in the blanks ourselves. So instead of having a two-way conversation with somebody else, we be the person who raises the question and answers the question and carries on the conversation without ever speaking to the other person.
Absolutely.
And then we have a whole virtual reality we've created about what's going on here that we haven't even checked out with them. So I think that one is critical.
I think so, actually, Mary. I think that, often I talk about the stories that we have created, or the narrative that we have actually created. Just thinking about a leader I was working with really recently, and he was wanting to have a particular conversation. And, he'd actually run it all through in his head, and actually was, anticipating and knew exactly what somebody was actually going to say and why he shouldn't do that, so he'd already had that conversation. So I think checking our own story, checking the assumptions, actually, but also, what's really going on for us, how are we feeling around that? What are our emotions around that? If we were thinking of something else or approaching it from a very different angle to problem solve, to learn, to help somebody to grow, then I think it can really shift our thinking and shift our own presence actually in that conversation as well.
Yeah. And once we've got to that point where we're clear about, what's going on for us and what we need to address, is there anything in terms of how we go into that conversation? So what would you say are some of the important or essential ingredients that we bring to that conversation?
Yeah. For me, I believe that the two main ingredients that we bring into that is around kindness, that we actually want to support and to really help the other individual. And also, I suppose, the courage of actually being able to have those conversations and to really help somebody to have greater self-awareness, to learn and grow, to support their performance, to maybe, unearth some of their own insights or thinking that they haven't had a chance to actually maybe even think about or been asked those questions actually before. So for me, that the kindness of just going, I want this person to succeed in whatever it may be. And, I want them to actually feel that has been a really good conversation as a result of that. But I think sometimes that courage, so that was my two images there. And I think when we can bring those into our being and really support us, it can really help everyone actually in those conversations, because there's a great intention there. We know that relationships are built on trust. So if I don't trust you, then I am probably unlikely to really hear what you're going to say there as well. And I suppose also, even one of the other things is about thinking about how we build that relationship first. So, we know that the ratio of positivity and encouragement against sort of more challenging conversations, it's 5-1, minimum 3-1. And I think that is really critical, that we actually set about building a relationship based on strengths before we start to maybe get into those trickier conversations. So can I?
And I wanted to just pick up on a couple of things there. One of them is first of all, I think that's a great point. The kindness one, I couldn't agree more. I really strongly believe that when we lead with the heart, we find connections which are far deeper than just our work roles and the interfaces we have as a result of our role, because we're opening up a deeper level in ourselves, so therefore we're giving other people permission to. But that can be, and that brings about vulnerability, it brings about authenticity. But if we're in an environment where, if that's not encouraged, it can be difficult. So I was just going to go back to the kindness point about what if the relationships you've got around you, or the persons that you need to have the conversations with, are people you've got some difficulty with, and there's some tension there. How do you stay in kindness when you know that there's some tension in the relationship?
Absolutely. Great question, and one that has come up a number of times actually as well with different clients that I've worked with, Mary. And I think it's sometimes about being really intentional about changing the trajectory of that relationship or that conversation. And it could be something as simple as, being able to say, I'm noticing that every time we have an interaction, it escalates or it descalates, it can actually just, be more negative than I would really want it. And I would like to take some responsibility in changing that. And I would really like us to have a different conversation. Is there anything that you need to say to me that actually will enable that so that we can actually move forward?
I love that. I love that because what you're doing is you're saying, when I step into a space where I'm willing to find a way of changing this dynamic. So it's not saying you're wrong for the dynamic or I'm wrong for the dynamic. It's like I'm recognizing that I want to step into a space of change because I want it to be better. I think that's incredibly empowering, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask you a question, Mary?
Oh, go on.
Just, from the work that you've been doing around the female age as well. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how do you believe that women can use some of the ideas that we've just initially talked about here to really help their conversations and also from your own experience with females?
No, thank you. It's a great question. So, I'll preface it by saying that there isn't really a gender difference in how we do conversations. I think that they're generally the same. But there are some behaviours which are different, gender-defined differences. If our conversations are getting into conflict territory or difficulty or crunchy conversations, we do see a definite difference between men and women. And generally, women tend to, not always, and if there's women out there listening, let me just acknowledge that, but women tend to shy away from or not feel comfortable going into a conversation which may have some tension to it or may have some degree of conflict. And I would say that that's the area that actually helps to work through, because our bridge to our greater self, our bridge to our greater understanding of who we are, is usually through meeting a perspective or a view of the world which is at odds with our own. So conflict usually is something that serves our better self and serves our longer term development. But when we're inside it, or when we're working with somebody that we're finding challenging, or we're having to go in and deliver a difficult conversation, that can be hard to hold on to. But that's the essential truth. It always helps us to grow to a greater sense of who we are. But for women, I would say the first thing is, conflict is okay. We are conditioned as girls and women to say conflict means that we're not being kind and we're not being thoughtful and we're not being supportive of people. Sometimes that is true when we're in conflict, but sometimes conflict is necessary to get to a greater understanding, both parties, of where we are and where we need to go. So conflict has a part in our working life, and feeling comfortable with that. And how we can feel comfortable with that is, first of all, when we recognize a conversation that will challenge us, is make sure we recognize it is challenging us. The conversation itself is not challenging. It's us going through a process to get to greater awareness. So that takes a bit of pressure off it, in terms of, oh, I can choose to see this challenge in a different way. I can choose to see it as I will be more aware and more capable of understanding things as a result of this conversation. So taking the conflict word out and the difficult word out and seeing it as just as a conversation. And the challenge may be something that we just need to recognise and work. And then the other things are just simple techniques. Is I always say, be really grounded when you're going into a conversation that will challenge you. And what I mean is just simple things like grounding means really being connected to your breath for a moment or two before you go in, taking deep breaths, really feeling them breaths, holding them in your body and letting them out, because they're starting to bring you down to a level of relaxation. You're connecting different parts of your brain and your parasympathetic system, and that releases the stress, releases the tension, because you don't want to go into conversation with tension. And then go in prepared, just have some really clear points that you want to make, but be ready to listen to the other points as well. And the other bit, and I know we're going to go into this with your bits, is I always say agreement is not the end goal of a conversation. It may be, but generally what you want is acceptance and alignment. And that might be accept that we disagree on some fundamental points here, but we align on how we're going to show our face back out to the wider team or to other peers or whatever it is. So agreement isn't a thing. People do not need to believe the same things I believe. They do not need to hold the same views that I hold. We just need to understand each other and find a way forward.
Yeah. Fantastic. I love the acceptance and alignment, isn't it? Because we don't always have to agree. But I think there should be something new at the end of that conversation. So
absolutely. Because that's the whole point, isn't it? Otherwise, we might as well carry on playing it in our head. You've talked about a few things. I know this is something you do a lot. So what would be some of some of the key takeaways that you would want to share with people? So let me bring this.
Thank you,
this
Mary.
back up here.
Yeah, really, from all of the work that we've done, all of the research that I'm reading and understanding, that it may seem very simple, but I've summarized them into, what the sort of, I suppose, the foundation of them is actually built on. And they probably work in a particular order. And I think one of the things that we find is people will say, oh yeah, no, I know all of that. But what we tend to find is that a lot of us are not as good at all four in one conversation. So, and we know that when we're lacking in one of these, it's probably going to lessen the quality of the conversation that we actually have.
Yeah.
So we can really start to, I suppose, amplify and these four core skills, behaviors, then, is that, listening to understand, one of Stephen Covey's fundamental 7 habits, wasn't it, around seek first to understand rather than to be understood. And I do think that is probably fundamental. And it's much more than, I suppose, just, listening for the sort of facts and what we agree and we disagree on. It's about listening to what the values are, what are the emotions, what else is actually at play here with the individual. And being able, and I think when you talk there about that presence, actually, Mary, and being grounded, it's only when we are grounded and we have that real presence that we can really listen to understand, because otherwise we're often hooked in our own stories and our own narrative around that. So I think that fundamentally is one of the key things there. Then about asking questions, and I've said there about asking powerful questions. Asking questions, I think, is an art and a science, actually. And it's not just about creating some sort of mutual understanding about the facts there, actually, either. It's really, asking questions that help people think, that might help them uncover a new insight or some new thinking, actually, as well. So, being able to ask a question like, working with a leader of a team and they're introducing a new change initiative, the how and what they're going to do isn't really going to give them much new insight. But, how do they want their team to be feeling? What do they want their team to be doing differently as a result of this initiative? Hopefully is a very different conversation there as well. I always believe that the importance between the support and the challenge is really critical. That, we know that someone knows that we're there to help them grow, to help them actually develop, but also we're challenging them enough to help them perform and maybe actually sort of, I suppose, raise their own performance or their own thinking actually as well.
Yeah,
I have said here about making clear agreements and driving accountability, and particularly in the workplace as well, when we're asking somebody, maybe if it's around an interpersonal, behavioral challenge, it could be around a performance, that there's some clear agreements around what the next steps are going to be or who's going to do what, when the follow-up is actually going to be as well, or even just summarizing on the bits that they have agreed on and some of the bits that they have, the parts that they haven't actually as well. So I tried to keep it very simple, but I think if we think about each of our conversations that we have and thinking how well we're doing in those, and I know there's a lot of factors at play in terms of, time and pressure and, things moving and changing very fast in organizations. But I think sometimes we take that step back and start to think about, how am I using these in my conversations, and what more could I actually do?
Yeah. I mean, they're absolutely, they balance things. I mean, they talk about balancing them, but balance is critical in all conversations, isn't it? So that seek first to understand and be in that listening mode, as opposed to staying in the mode of storytelling in your own head, which is what a lot of us do. It's like, how can we quiet our own mind and just be in a place of literally receiving what we're hearing from the other person and listening to that and understanding it without wanting to fill in the gaps, just understand.
Absolutely.
And the questions bit, it struck me as one of the things I find is sometimes people really struggle to ask questions of somebody who's more senior than them. They almost feel like they don't have the right to. And I think some of the questions you suggested there were great ones. Is if somebody's saying, this is our new strategy or our new way of working, it's like, well, what are your expectations of me or the team I manage as a result of this change? They're powerful questions, but we often think that it's like, well, they're my boss, they obviously expect me to do it, I can't ask them, or they're the senior leader. But actually, leaders need questions too. They need to understand where the gaps are, and they need to understand where your thinking is, so they understand and know how to support you.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that, isn't it? And there's something about, I think, being really intentional around that and giving people permission as well to actually ask them, and which, really helps with that, the psychological safety, of being able to say, I don't understand, or I need more help, or, whatever that interpersonal risk may be as well. Absolutely. Yeah.
And then the other one, the challenge and support one, getting a balance between the two, because as leaders, ourselves, we have to get a balance between when we need to challenge somebody because we need more of them than they're giving, or they need some boundary setting, or they're just performing to a lower level than we're expecting. We need to challenge them, but we also need to have that support of actually helping people and help them to work their own way around things. And I've seen leaders who lead with one or lead with the other almost entirely, and they forget about the other one. And we then see the consequences of that. Always leading with challenge means that people don't feel they can be open, they don't feel they can share their difficulties. Always leading with support means that there's usually poor boundaries, and things like performance are not really addressed when they need to be.
Absolutely. Or left too long and it becomes a real problem. Yeah, I do really like the work of Kim Scott and the Radical Candor, where it's, care personally and challenge directly is one of the things that she uses. And, I think, but we have to, it's back to building that relationship first. It's about gaining trust. It's about showing that actually you do care about the individual or the teams that we're actually leading actually as well. So I definitely think, so I think that, being really clear and being kind, being courageous and being kind, shouldn't be, excluded from having tough conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, I think that's great. It really just. So if somebody's listening to this and they're thinking, oh well, what can I do to apply these? What are some of the actions that they could take from today that would actually maybe help them to get better at this?
Well, one of the things I think is, I'm always advocating that we become greater observers of ourselves and of others actually as well. So maybe a starting point might be even just observing the conversations that are actually going on around them. When I, just actually almost from that bystander perspective, and then maybe some reflection on their own conversations. How often do they actually listen to understand? How often do they ask questions? Who is doing most of the talking actually as well? Even just using these 4 skills and sort of thinking about, I'm really good at that, but I'm not as strong at actually the agreement or the alignment at the end of it. So maybe using that as a bit of a stock take and thinking, okay, going back from that strengths place, where am I really strong? And what's the tweak that I could do with making? And, so really what needs your attention? Because when we give ourselves time and permission to actually reflect and think, we know what we need to do, but we might need some support, perhaps, from an external, just around maybe some of our own beliefs around how we view conflict or tricky conversations. Because that internal narrative, as we know, and you said before, Mary, that operating system sometimes needs upgraded, and that's sometimes when
without
we
a doubt.
sometimes
daily.
absolutely, my own included.
Yeah. Very good. Well, I think that they're great takeaways for people to do. I mean, what we always say at the end of this is, wherever you are in your leadership journey or wherever you are in your career, is that there's various ways you can actually help improve. There's lots of development opportunities out there. There's lots of training opportunities out there, and there are lots of people who actually provide the support and the coaching that you need as well. And that's why I'm here to showcase some amazing coaches in my circle who actually do this work. If you want to carry on the conversation with us, Fionnuala is on LinkedIn. It's Fionnuala McIntyre, FCIPD, if I remember it rightly, which is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Personal Development. And you'll find Fionnuala there, and you'll find me, Mary Maguire, as well on LinkedIn. You'll also find us. You can email us as well. Fionnuala at futuremotioncoaching.com, which is her own website and talks about the work that she does. And I'm at agents2change.com. That's number 2, agents2change.com. So we'd love to keep the conversation going. And even if you're re-listening to this, do put your comments and your thoughts in the comments box, and we'll certainly come back to you. And we're wishing you a great day.
Oh, thank you so much, Mary, and thank you so much for having me on today. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank
Have
you
a great
to
day.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.